And so when I think about Middle English, I think of a language, a period of time in the language when the vocabulary was becoming more like English, becoming more French, more Latinate, and the grammar was becoming more like English, but the pronunciation was still the older pronunciation.
How do we know how Middle English sounded like? We don't have any recordings from that period, so what clues do we have?
So you have to piece it together from various, pieces of evidence. One of the key things, and this is very difficult for modern English speakers to relate to or understand, but prior to the modern English period, so let's say before the 1500s and 1600s, English spelling was largely phonetic. The first dictionaries don't really appear until the early 1600s and the first spelling guides. So the idea that there's a standard way of spelling a word, there's a right or wrong way of spelling a word, didn't really exist prior to that point. That's a more modern concept. Prior to that point, people had to spell words like they sounded and spell them as best they could. And at the time, the letters of the alphabet tended to represent specific sounds because English adopted the alphabet from Latin. And within Latin, the alphabet had specific sounds. The letters had specific sounds. So they just applied that to English. English had some unique sounds, so they had to invent some new letters early on, and most of those died out. But again, it was phonetic, and it's difficult. It makes it difficult to read Old and Middle English texts because you don't have standard spellings. But it's wonderful if you're trying to recreate the pronunciations because you see how people pronounced them. And in fact, you see regional variations. Scribes writing in southern England tended to spell the same words the same, but they spelled them differently from scribes writing in northern England or scribes writing in the West Country or different parts of England. And you can pick up from those differences local regional accents. So it's really fascinating. So that's part of the answer, is just going back to a time when spelling was more phonetic. Occasionally, you also had writers and scribes who would mention the way the language was pronounced, sometimes comparing English to French or English to Latin in the way certain words were pronounced. So that's helpful. And then you also occasionally have writers who wrote rhyming poetry. Rhymes are very important because much of the surviving literature we have from the Middle English period is poetry, a large portion of it, and a lot of it was written in rhyming verse. And so if two words are rhyming, they have the same or pretty much the same vowel sound. Well, a lot of times they don't have the same vowel sound today. So that helps reconstruct the sound of certain vowels. Puns kind of work the same way. When writers are making puns with two words, they often pronounce the same or very similarly. And then by the time you get into the 1500s and 1600s, you actually have writers who are writing about the language and the way it sounds. And they say, well, this is in very detail, because they were trying to create a more standardized phonetic alphabet. And they were saying, this is, how we pronounce all these words. And they actually have long list, a word list and how they were all pronounced phonetically. So that helps. And then also historical linguists are able to compare how vowel sounds evolve. So we know that, for example, the long A sound in English began as an ah sound, which we still have in words like father or the word what or swan. It's still there. But most of the time it represents an A sound today, like cake and bake and same and so on. But we know that to get from ah to a, that's pronounced very differently in the mouth. The tongue has to do completely different shapes. So it had to evolve over time. So it would have gone from ah to a to e to a. So it takes a while to get there. So we know based on that if we're looking at a period of time in between, the sound would have had to have been somewhere in between. So there's a lot of these ways in which historical linguists piece this information together.
Juan that apero with his shore sota, the druchta marchat perse to the rota, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which virtue engendered is the flour,